Welcome to Stories for Power. I'm Deana Lewis, and I'm a member of Just Practice Collaborative. Stories for Power is an oral history project produced by Just Practice Collaborative and Creative Interventions. It explores the political lineage and historical experiments that gave way to this wave of transformative justice, community accountability, and prison abolition. In each episode of Stories for Power, we speak with activists and organizers from different cities who were and continue to be at the forefront of feminist abolitionist praxis. They talked about the bold experiments and interventions they were a part of in the early 2000s through 2010, and how their work informed abolitionist, transformative justice, and community accountability organizing today. Don't worry. If any terms or words have you confused, we will do our best to link to resources in the show notes. And you can always go back to listen to the special introduction episode for more context. In this episode, you will hear from two inspiring abolitionist feminists, Alisa Bierria and Beth Richie. Each of them published groundbreaking books that are vital to understanding and remembering the stories of abolition feminist movement organizing. We will talk about the courageous and radical work they were a part of and how their work informed abolitionist, transformative justice, and community accountability organizing today. Have you facilitated a process using community accountability tools or strategies? We want to hear your stories. Creative Interventions and Just Practice Collaborative want to share new stories from people who are taking action to end interpersonal violence without the use of police or carceral systems. Find the link in our show notes to learn more. A note for our listeners. We will be discussing violence, including police violence, intimate partner violence, and community violence. We encourage you to take care of yourself, and we understand that taking care of yourself can also look like not listening to this podcast until you're ready. Now let me introduce our guests. They have amazing and extensive experiences and knowledge. I'll do my best to summarize. We have linked their full bios in the show notes. You can also learn more on our website, storiesforpower.org. Beth Richie is the former department head of Criminology, Law, and Justice, and LAS Distinguished Professor of Black Studies and Criminology, Law, and Justice at the University of Illinois, Chicago. The emphasis of her scholarly and activist work has been on the ways that race, ethnicity, and social position affect women's experiences of violence and incarceration, focusing on the experiences of African American battered women and sexual assault survivors. Dr. Richie is the author of multiple books, including Compelled to Crime, The Gender Entrapment of Black Battered Women, Arrested Justice, Black Women, Violence, and America's Prison Nation, and most recently, a co-authored book with Angela Davis, Gina Dent, and Erica Miners titled Abolition Feminism Now.
My name is Beth Richie, and I am super excited to be in this conversation, both this particular podcast, but also the overall project, to reflect back on the 45 years maybe, that I've been doing anti-violence work as an abolition feminist. I started this work in the 90s. I was working as a social worker at a community-based organization that sort of had a very strong, lively political commitment as an anti-Black racism activist group. We had campaigns, we ran a health clinic, we had educational programs, food justice work. It really was one of those moments in that particular historical moment where being part of a radical movement for racial justice surrounded me. And as I was doing that work with sort of full enthusiasm and commitment, that kind of young energy that like keeps you up all night and ready to do more despite, some obvious limits, I looked around and the questions of gender equity, gender justice, let alone the kind of recognition of women's leadership and women's positionality in the work was just absent. We were there and we were doing a lot of work, but people who identified as women were not recognized for doing that work. In particular, it seemed that the ways that racial justice was framed at that place, or racialized violence, or racial discrimination, it didn't include attention to people who identified as women, or people who identified as queer, people who identified as gender fluid. We didn't use those terms then. we were invisible. So I convened a group of people and said, what's happening here? And we talked and realized that it was both the patriarchy of the actual activist work, but it was also that women, people identified as women, were afraid, were in hostile relationships, were not free to sort of travel the activist space that the organization had created. And so we started an anti-violence program. And it seemed to me that it was like a natural thing to do. Again, coming from an organizing background, when you need to make change, you get together with other activists and try to make change. So we started an anti-violence program at the time. It was one of the first ones that specifically dealt with Black women and other women of color in New York City. And, since then, feels like the work has been my world. I've always done it, always cared about it, always felt like it was the place I could make the best change, and it was the place that would change me the most. So there I was. The abolition part came a little bit later. Maybe I'll let Alisa talk a little bit, and then I'll get back to how I found myself working with women inside jails and prisons.
Alisa Bierria is a Black feminist philosopher and an assistant professor in the Department of Gender Studies at UCLA. Her forthcoming book, Inconceivable Agency, Race, Gender Violence, and the Carceral Imagination, explores how Black women's survival actions within the structures of criminalization and anti-Black gendered violence challenge philosophical understandings of agency. She's a co-editor of the 2-volume collection, Abolitionist Feminisms, and a special issue of Social Justice titled Community Accountability, Emerging Movements to Transform Violence. An advocate and organizer within the feminist anti-violence movement for over 25 years, Alisa has co-founded and co-led several national organizations, including Survived and Punished, which advocates for the freedom of criminalized survivors of domestic and sexual violence.
I started officially maybe back in 1996 when I volunteered at a battered women's program. That's what it was called back then. Tompkins County Battered Women's Program. I am a survivor of domestic violence and sexual violence, and I knew that I wanted my work to be in that area. I also was really interested in thinking about questions of survivor life and survivor integrity and the ways in which survivors make decisions about their own safety and connections and so on. So I think I was just connected or attracted to the work like a moth to a flame. And then after I graduated from undergrad, I moved to Seattle and just started doing everything I could to connect to the anti-violence work that was happening. So I became a volunteer at Seattle Rape Relief on the crisis line. Seattle Rape Relief was one of the first anti-rape organizations in the U.S. I think it started in 1972. I was on the board of the Northwest Network of Bisexual, Trans, Lesbian, and Gay Survivors of Abuse. I worked as an advocate, a community advocate at the East Cherry YWCA, which focused on Black survivors of domestic violence. And then there were several other organizations. I just kind of filled up my life with anti-violence work because I wanted to learn as much as possible and let it inspire me and drive me, basically taking the wheel of my life for the next 25 years. And then Seattle Rape Relief sadly closed in 1999, I think. And the volunteers from the crisis line organized to establish another organization called Communities Against Rape and Abuse, or CARA, in Seattle. We had a vision for CARA. Our vision was that we didn't want it to be only a direct services organization. We did support groups occasionally, but mostly we wanted to focus on community organizing as an anti-violence practice, as an anti-violence praxis. And I think that shift from direct services to community organizing, it's not that the work wasn't politicized. Like I was going to all the coalition conferences, all the things, right? I met advocates who were deeply politicized, but there was something about the shift to community organizing in a more intentional way that made that politicization more explicit and then opened a pathway for us to do some really interesting experiments. So I can talk more about how I became an abolitionist through Cara's trajectory. I'll say this, that Seattle Rape Relief closed in 99. Critical Resistance had its opening conference in 98. Insight had its opening conference in 2000. So it was like right at the millennium, right at that juncture, that everything started to come together. I let the work bring me to abolition, right? And so the people at CARA, there were several folks, we did not have consensus about abolition. And I was one of the people who just wasn't really sure. What happened is that CARA, one of our members connected with Critical Resistance. CR was having film festivals at that time, and we decided to host a film festival. And I think, at least at that time, we were the first non-CR chapter to host a film festival. So it was an anti-rape organization that was the first one to do that. And through that work, that process of organizing that festival, that development, trying to figure out which films made the most sense given the needs of our communities, figuring out the workshops, because it was more like a mini conference that we did, trying to translate community organizing into pedagogical approaches and workshops, bringing speakers in to talk about areas that we were less familiar with. It was through that practice of collective event planning and community organizing that we all collectively came together to articulate, like it compelled us to articulate an abolitionist politics. Because I think that what happened before the festival is couldn't come to consensus, not a crisis. Let's see what happens, right? Let's just see what happens. Let's see what happens if we all learn together. Not Cara teaching the community, that's not what happened, but Cara learning with and alongside the community. And through that practice of collective learning, we came to a politics and articulated a politics of abolition, really from a very particular survivor perspective. Right? So we were grounded in a positionality of survivors. So it wasn't just abolition because prisons are evil institutions. Policing is an evil institution. It was that prisons and policing are destructive to the lives of survivors. So it was that logic, right, that reasoning that brought us to a consensus around the politics of abolition. I think we had the film festival in 2002. And of course, my colleague Theron Kigva Masood Vashti from Cara, Ebony Colbert, I think Sandra Ibarra maybe. We all went to the Insight Conference in Santa Cruz, the first one in 2000. And that also just helped pave the way for us to create a vocabulary around feminist abolition, try to bring the critiques around structural gender violence and structural state violence together. That also just helped position us to have that film festival in 2002, and then the rest was history.
I love hearing this history of Cara, which to me stands out as one of the organizations, at least in my thinking, that was so clearly articulating abolition feminism before people were putting those two words together. I really appreciate your story of being pulled to that through the work, as opposed to sort of co-signing a label, right, that gets sort of put out there as the way we're supposed to be or the work we're supposed to do, how we're supposed to act. I also appreciate that the history that you provide gives some lens into what was happening around the tension between direct service and organizing. Because in my experience, when I realized in the early 90s that the struggle against anti-Black racial violence was happening alongside of, but not at all incorporating, the white mainstream analysis of gender violence, and vice versa, the white mainstream analysis of gender violence was articulating a kind of false notion of sisterhood and gender essentialism. It was clear to me that those two worlds couldn't come together, in part because the white feminist mainstream anti-violence movement was interested in direct services And the anti-Black racism radical organizations were looking for campaigns around justice. And so it was not only the lack of analysis around gendered racism or racialized gender violence, but it was also that the strategies were so different. And for me, this discussion is reminding me that my instinct around abolition came because I came up working around anti-Black racism, which at the time, even when it didn't include gender violence, was articulating stories of police violence as part of state violence that were controlling and dominating. I mean, that was always part of the narrative in the community-based organizing work that I was doing around racial justice. And so to think about a justice movement without thinking about policing and the violence of prisons, which is, I mean, I thought the anti-gender violence movement was a justice movement, right? So how could they be articulating a strategy for change that involved using the carceral state? It just was incompatible to what I thought radical work was. Little did we know, right, Alisa, that's exactly what the analysis was, and that therefore it did compromise the white mainstream early sort of 1990s work around gender-based violence. It was clearly co-opting work that was radical work. And I think it's why so many of us who were doing organizing and campaign work at the time have gotten erased from that history because our work was so incompatible with the dominant strategies that, of course, became more and more powerful and controlling through things like the passing of the Violence Against Women Act, et cetera. The formulation of really rigid state coalitions, not the radical ones, but the really rigid state coalitions that were interested, in foundation grants and evaluating programs and best practices, all of those kinds of things.
Yeah, I should think more about where the anti-violence work was in the 90s. I think I've thought a little bit about it, certainly in the 70s and 60s. There have been brilliant books out, Emily Thuma's book, All of Our Trials, and so on, but less so about the 90s, right? And I know that intersectionality, right? Crenshaw writes the 2 articles, but the second article is really intentionally about anti-violence work, the mapping the margins. In 92, there's the Rodney King verdict happens and the rebellions, and then 96, your book. I'm skipping things. I'm just identifying the different points on the timeline map that I know had an impact on the rest of my sort of development of politics and political world making, right? And then, of course, I think that 9/11 and the wars, that particular pivot around state violence was just, I guess my point is that I feel like Black feminists, other feminists were seeding things. I think, as you're saying, Beth, that those things were not, these points of knowledge production were not taken up by the anti-violence organizations field at all. At all. In fact, it was actively hostile against these points of knowledge production. I think you were more deeply sort of in the struggle within the field, right? Because weren't you part of the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence? Yeah. And I feel like in my work, I have always been walking around it, talking to it, critiquing, being critiqued by it, right? So I think that I haven't identified myself as part of the field, but in actuality, I've always been on the margins of that field. And so I had less experience having arguments with feminists around cops. My whole political world was about Black liberation, racial justice, fuck the police. And then it was just a matter of time of trying to figure out how to bring these things together from the perspective of survivors in particular, right? So you planted the seeds so that when shit hit the fan again and again and again, right? But particularly in the new millennium, we were able to pick up those flowers and run with it. Yeah.
I hadn't thought of it like that. It's sort of a beautiful metaphor and feels like emotionally so accurate to me that the really serious political arguments that in many ways became personal arguments about the use of the carceral state in response to the horrific gender violence that was revealed in the 90s. I mean, certainly before, but in the mainstream in the 90s, right? It was so exhausting. We were so angry. We felt sort of like all of our hope had been stolen by a really rigid carceral feminism. I think we felt like we were losing. It is almost like we woke up and there was a generation of people like you who were just carrying it on. I remember that feeling after the first Insight Conference, that the small group of us, really because of, the age that we came into this work, were sort of ready to give it up, except of course we felt accountable to our communities and to survivors. We were out of strategies, we were out of energy. And when we looked around that room at the thousands of people who came to Insight, it felt like we could just not rest. It didn't feel like we could rest. It felt like we could be in community with so many other people who brought such rich, diverse experiences to the work. And I remember that like it was a bodily feeling for me. It was in my heart. It was in my mind. I felt like I was in tears the whole time because I felt such relief that there was a movement that became the movement of abolition feminists. And I think it reminds me to sort of name the writing of the Critical Resistance Insight Statement. It wasn't just a document, it was a document and a process that was trying to articulate abolition feminism. We didn't call that. It's not in the text anywhere. But that's really what we were trying to do when we wrote that, and all of the people who have rewritten it and elaborated on it and used it and modified it, I think that felt like a material representation of what was about to happen in the building of an abolition feminist movement.
This conversation is incredible, and I feel so lucky to be here. And I want to talk a little bit about how your books frame so much of the work we are and have been doing. So, Compelled to Crime in 2003, Arrested Justice in 2012, Abolition Feminism Now, and Abolition Feminisms in 2022. So more and more people are talking about abolition, and more books are being published on abolition. And the two of you have really made sure to insert feminism into abolition in general. Can you talk about why you believe this political moment seems more open to abolition and abolition feminism specifically? Also, how are your books playing a role in the moment that we are in now?
To Beth's point about the Critical Resistance Insight Statement from 2002, I think it was published. The brilliance of that statement is that you called it a statement that was material. I think that was the word that you used, right? It's such a statement that's grounded in a practice. And the way that I think about it is that it's practice to theory. Cara taught me so much about an approach to political analysis that's practice to theory. So the way in which the 5 points critiquing anti-violence practices, the 5 points critiquing anti-policing organizing practice that doesn't take into account gender, and then articulating some really concrete recommendations, that methodology of analysis, it's so critical for us to remember as organizers that are organizing in the 2020s. Right. And so with books, I was very fortunate to co-edit a 2-volume book, Abolition Feminisms, with Jakia Carruthers and Brooke Lober, 2 really wonderful feminist activists, academics. And the thing about the books is that it's not just that they articulate an analysis of abolition feminism. They set the stage for abolition feminist practice all around the world, right? And all across time. That's the other thing. So inside prisons, what abolition feminist practice is looking like through transformative justice collectives, the anti-war movement, all of this it's not just the theorizing, it's the practice that is supposed to get you to articulating a theory of abolition feminism, which is why we made it plural, abolition feminisms, because the politics, it's beyond the phrase, it's beyond the hashtag, it crosses geography, it crosses temporality. We're planting seeds, we're leaving ghosts, we're trying to talk to the people that are coming after us and the people that came before us, right? And so there's a way in which abolition feminism, it's a time traveler. It's a long-term movement. It's a long arc of politics making. Abolition feminism, it can be a really great intervention in masculinist anti-carceral organizing and a great intervention in carceral feminist work. It is, but it is more than that. It has its own life and history and set of legacies and knowledge producers and activist makers, right?
That's so beautiful. I love the way that you talk about going from practice to theory as an abolition feminist, which is kind of counter to how a lot of academics think about how you go from theory to practice. And it's one of the things that really distinguishes the transformative potential of abolition feminism is that it is practice that teaches us what we call theory or strategy or intervention, not the opposite. So important. And I think that's in part why, as you say, Alisa, it lasts over time. It invites lots of people in. It allows for, I mean abolition feminism allows for responding to immediate crisis, the kind of amazing campaign work for freedom that Survived and Punished does, for example. It allows for that. And it also allows for the really slow world-building work that it promises it will deliver. And so I think the both and part of abolition feminism really comes from the way that it's alive and it's living and it's experimental and it changes over time, but it gives us something to kind of wrap ourselves in or hold on to as something that's moving in a direction toward freedom. I think if you try to do abolition without feminism, or if you are a feminist and don't understand what abolition is required of you, then I think you miss that long arc that you described. In terms of the arc of the books that I've been involved in writing, I think Compelled to Crime was written really just to tell the story, to not tell the story, to reveal the story, to share the story of criminalized survivors. I didn't have that language. All of you came up with that brilliant language, but it to me was a way to sort of put a reality on the consequences of doing abolition work without feminism and feminism anti-violence work without abolition. The result is people are compelled to crime. And it was really written kind of as an invitation for people to wake the fuck up and look at what your work has done, right? And Arrested Justice really was a more poignant critique. I mean, that was like, okay, you really, really need to wake up now in some ways. It wasn't sort of the stories. It was the more analysis of how we won the mainstream and lost the movement and how carceral feminism has been so dangerous and so almost hateful to some people who are survivors, and how and I say our because I do feel like I was involved in the building of local and national anti-violence organization and movements, how our hands were dirty in that and that we had to do something different. I didn't end Arrested Justice with exactly what we had to do, but it's part of why Angela, Gina, and Erica and I came together to write Abolition Feminism Now. And so that to me is sort of the hope, sort of alongside Alisa, your books and so many other books that are really like, here's what we can do different. There is a possibility. There's strategies. It's not tomorrow, but it's someday. I think about what Derek says, when we think about abolition, you don't just think, okay, so we're going to wake up and be free. It's like, no, we're going to wake up and make our way the best way we can towards some world other than the one that we live in. And every step along the way build something different. So I don't know exactly how Compelled to Crime links to abolition feminism, except it was a way to really say, we have to do something different on behalf of the survivors. And I was mad when I wrote Arrested Justice. I feel more hopeful. It showed, yeah.
I loved it.
And abolition feminism has me a little more hopeful, especially the now part.
I love those books so much. I mean, I think that Compelled to Crime, like what it said in bright, bold red letters, is that prisons are killing Black women. That's what it said to me. Survivors trying to do their best to make decision under completely impossible circumstances, conditions, right? In the context of gender-based violence, poverty, all these different kinds of things that survivors are doing in order to manage the trauma that they've experienced. And then, of course, police violence, then you're in prison. So I think that Compelled to Crime clarified the politics for, criminalized survivor, because criminalized survivor, we didn't say, we're now going to start using criminalized. It wasn't like that. It was just that, I don't know who started it, but we just used that language because it was thoughtful about making explicit that some institution is making the choice to criminalize survivors, right? Survivors aren't choosing to be criminalized, right? They don't just happen to be in court. They are getting there through those pathways to crime that you described in Compelled to Crime. And so, yeah, I think that making those pathways just more explicit helps Survived and Punished articulate the explicitness of the criminalization of survivors and survival, which I also think is in your book, just more clearly. So I'm so thankful. And like I said, I think that the politics and the life building and the political vision, it's more than these, we have to speak, so we have to use language. We have to have some sort of shared vocabulary. But I think it's important, especially in this age of social media, to acknowledge that the phrases can only do so much work, right? And so there has to be more. That's why I think that the writing is so essential to getting that more across.
I appreciate you saying that. I never imagined that Compelled to Crime would ever sort of land in the world of influence for the amazing work that you and so many others have done. So I feel very humbled by that. And in honor of the stories that are in the book, of course. And I think when we sort of think about the current almost rush to abolition, I don't know what else to call it. I remember in the summer of 2020, it felt so uplifting. Like finally, they must have read your work and been on the website and listened to Shira talk and all the other people from Love and Protect. I just feel like there's a way that for a minute, it felt like everyone has read the Critical Resistance Insight Statement, and that's why we are where we are in the streets. And it wasn't long when it was clear, at least to me where I sit in Chicago, that people hadn't read. It doesn't matter that they didn't read it, but they didn't bring to the abolition work an analysis that was too far beyond the hashtag. And I appreciate what you said about how we need the long version of the story in order to really fill out the promise of what abolition feminism can bring. Because if we don't sort of think deeply and for a long time and have it emerge from a practice, then I think it can easily be not only misunderstood, but erased. There was a time in my classes on campus, students would say, when you introduce yourself, I'm an abolitionist. And so at the end, when I would say, well, what does that mean? I went to a protest when George Floyd was killed. Not, I think about the world that I want to build, and it has to include the following, there's enough for everyone, the things that we know that we care about. So
I really appreciate the reminder of abolition as a practice, and also that there's room for everyone to come into abolition. This is also a good segue into thinking about successes. Can you share what success stories stick out to you? Like, what made those stories happen?
I think of two things about success. I first want to say that success to me is different than winning campaigns. That success to me is about building movements. And at the same time, I want people free. So I think that one success is the cumulative successful campaigns that have freed criminalized survivors. And I want to sort of lift that up and really say that to me, every time someone walks outside of those gates and lives free, that's part of both an individual freedom and a movement success. And I want to hold, count, name all of that work, because it's not just the moment coming out of the gate, but it's the work that went into the letters written, the showing up at hearings, the engagement with families, the changing understandings of community members. So I think that's huge. And I don't mean that like to avoid the question as like, well, it's everything. I really do mean that we have to count the individual freedom and the story of success that leads to that freedom as one of the biggest ones. And in some ways, a smaller one, we've already talked about the CR Insight statement, that every time I see someone using it, changing it, doing a study guide around it, I feel like that was a success, not, again, the document, but the process that laid open a chance for people to think about the ways that abolition feminism can be made real. Sort of as a tool, but really more as a invitation to be part of a process of thinking about what abolition feminism is. I would name the CR Insight statement.
I would co-sign both of those passionately. You can't see me because it's a podcast, but I held up a praise hand around the, freedom as a point that needs to be lifted up all the time. I guess I have two very similar points, which is when Cara did the Critical Resistance Film Festivals and we came to that abolitionist politics, let me just speak from my perspective. The reason I had hesitation around abolition for a while was that I did not know how to answer the question, what else is there for survivors? I understood that police and prisons were terrible for survivors. What I was scared about was that survivors, by and large, relied on the idea of prisons and police. I took that reliance, that kind of existential kind of pull towards this idea of like a magic 911 that would come and save you. I took that seriously. I did not negate it. And so I think that the work that we did was that we figured out a way to be comfortable with not being able to answer the question, what else is there? We held that as just a question that was just there. Maybe we could figure it out, but in any case, we, the broad we, as a movement, as a community, had to figure it out. It was our moral obligation to figure it out. I want to pause there and just say that this is what I mean by practice to theory, right? Sometimes there's this moment of just not knowing. And I think that that's okay. Like, be cool about it. You know what I mean? And occupy that moment of not knowing, continuing to do the practice, and then seeing what the practice brings back to you. And what the practice brought back to us was an opportunity to begin to do some experiments around community-based approaches to safety and accountability. And so we were experimenting with different communities that had different contexts of gender violence. And then Insight was at the same time beginning to write its first anthology, Color of Violence. And the editors asked us they said, submit your model. And I was like, there is no model. I can describe what we've been doing. But then what happened is when that invitation occurred, then it compelled us, again, to articulate what it was we were doing in a more systematic way, which is what became the Taking Risks article in the Color of Violence anthology. And so my point is, you don't have to know everything in order to do the work. There is a lot of faith that comes into play for community organizing. It may not always work out. Certainly, transformative justice and community accountability has had a really amazing road and a rocky road, right? We're all learning together. But unless you push yourself to the point of not knowing, then it's hard to bring yourself to do the experiments, because then you're just like doing the thing that everybody has always done forever, just like an automaton, just repeating the same thing, right? So that's the first thing. And then the second thing, very similar, is Free Marissa Now. Marissa Alexander, Black woman, domestic violence survivor in Florida, tried to defend herself from her abusive husband and did successfully, I should say, defend her life which is why she is still here with us today, right? But then the Florida prosecutor tried to punish her for that survival, and she went to trial and got 20 years. And so I did not have the language for defense campaign at the time. I had called a number on a flyer. I don't really remember how I connected with people who were beginning to do the work. I connected with Samaya Coleman and some other organizers, and then we began to build an idea of a defense campaign. I sort of knew about Joanne Little. Like, I knew that name. I knew what roughly happened, right? I knew there was a movement that freed Joanne Little in 1974, a Black woman in North Carolina who had been raped by a jail guard while she was in jail. She killed him, and North Carolina wanted to put her to death for that. But a movement, a broad-based movement, mobilized to free her from that charge. So I knew something about that, but there wasn't a lot written at that time in 2012, I think. So we had to move forward by faith. And let me tell you, that was hard. That was really hard. I remember a comment on our little campaign blog that somebody left that said, "They're never going to free her. I don't know what y'all are doing anyways." And I was just like, you know what? I'm going to free her if it takes me the rest of my life. This is like, I understood where that was coming from, but I refused to give in to the nihilism of all of that. Like, there had to be a way to figure it out. And I don't mean to suggest that if you only work hard enough, then you can win a campaign. That's not what I mean. What I mean is, I'm not going out like that. I want to do the experiment, see it all the way through, learn all that we can learn together, and then adapt our strategies and work together and try to figure it out. Eventually, Marissa was released. She won an appeal, and then she ended up being forced to take a plea deal, and then she was released, and now she's doing great. She's an activist and on social media. And then that helped us connect with Chicago Alliance to Free Marissa Alexander, which became Love and Protect. It helped us connect to Stand With Nanhee, which is a campaign in California. It helped us connect to California Coalition for Women Prisoners. And those organizations and formations ended up founding Survived and Punished. So I would have never guessed that calling a phone number on a flyer would lead to that trajectory. And so I can't give in to a comment that says, "I don't know what you're doing. They're never going to free her anyway." I mean, maybe, but I need to pursue it. There has to be a level of faith around it. And I don't know what will happen, but I want to see what would happen if we work together and continue to imagine strategies together, even if we don't really know what we're doing. You know what I mean? Like, we learn what we're doing, we write it down. And now there's discussions about defense campaigns for survivors and people doing it on their own, you know, like just very organically. Like, it's a different consciousness around that kind of organizing that came about through work, you know, not through a theory. We didn't first write an article about defense campaigns, right? It just came about through work and through love.
That's such a beautiful story. I am moved to sort of reflect on that we have to have faith in order to get free is so profound, both on the level of the defense campaign, but also that's what survivors do. That there's no like, when you leave, there'll be this, or once you're free from the tyranny of the abuse, life is going to, I mean, it really is believing. And in abolition, when slaves were walking north, it wasn't because they knew what the North looked like, right? It was because there's something about abolition and feminism that allows people to have some kind of belief or faith that freedom will deliver something, and a community of support that you're not walking alone, that there are other people who maybe also don't know where they're going or don't know what it's going to look like or don't know how or when it's going to happen. But they're people who are working in coalition, in collaboration, community, and in love to sort of set you free because that sets me free. So the notion of the faith is so important in doing this work.
I think it's beautiful to think about love and faith in these different ways because we often have to rely on them to lean into uncertainty. Can you share some challenges that you've come across in this work, and how did those challenges grow your work? Also, as you think back, I would love to hear what other lessons or learnings you'd like to share with new organizers.
So, CARA was a nonprofit, and oh boy, did that bring a can of worms, right? I didn't have the title of executive director, but I had all the responsibilities of an executive director, by which I mean find the funds, find the money in order to make sure that people get paid. The money is very strange now. The money is here, like for different kinds of feminist abolition work. I don't know how that happened. I will tell you that in the early 2000s, that stone was dry as a mug. Like it was just, I could not find a grant at some point in the mid 2000s to save my life. It was so stressful. Eventually, I went to school, and the folks who took over CARA, they also had the same struggle, and eventually it had to close, sadly. But the thing that I learned is that sometimes organizations should close. It got a lot of support when it first began in 1999 from the city of Seattle, which was pretty progressive. And then the administrations changed because that's what happens in politics. And the new administration was like neoliberal on, exponential. And they wanted to call survivors customers and that were, getting services or purchasing. So they just tried to put a neoliberal framework, a market logic framework on certainly a non-market project, right? And so at first we bent, we translated, we coded, we did all the things, right? Get the money and run like that. We tried all of that, but that I feel shortened my lifespan. I don't think that was a sustainable thing. I feel like it just wasn't going to work. And anyways, they weren't ever going to let it work for too long at the end of the day. So I felt very frustrated about that, about my leadership at CARA at the end, because I couldn't figure out how to keep it afloat. I didn't know what language I could use. I just couldn't figure it out. But here's what happened. After CARA closed, the Taking Risks article continued to live. And also, like all the other brilliant work that the people at CARA did, like Joelle Bruner, who did really brilliant disability liberation theory, the reproductive justice work that folks did, like a lot of our work continues to live on in different spaces. The Taking Risk article in particular got translated into Spanish and German and just got circulated all over. And still, there's shout outs, right, to the article. And so never would I have anticipated that, and when we all got together in Theron's apartment and tried to figure out how to write this article, that it would continue on 15, 20 years and counting. So just because something has to stop or something has to close or there is heartbreak, it doesn't mean that the work is negated. Sometimes the work transforms its being. It takes another form. And that's another point about faith. You did your best work, you put it out there. Let's see what happens. It's a seed. Let's see what kind of flower, what kind of tree grows in the future. I believe in relationships. I believe in the liberation, the relationality that's cultivated in the context of community organizing. I mean, I just had a medical crisis in December and people just really, they had my back. And it's funny because I'm pretty introverted and pretty independent. I just didn't anticipate. I don't know why. I just didn't anticipate. But people were like, here's some DoorDash, here are flowers. I got so many flowers, so much chocolate. Like it was really lovely. I'm used to being in a position of helping and assisting others. I just did not anticipate so much love coming my way after I had this thing happen. And this goes to the point I want to answer with, which is that I'm pretty analytical, but what I have learned is trying to figure out ways to be creative, ways to use the other part of my mind, sometimes out of necessity. I'm a fan of art, but I don't think of myself as an artist. But lately, I've been trying to write a short story just to challenge myself and to see what happens. And what I have found in that practice is that it is touching parts of me that didn't even know existed. So I think that trying to find a creative outlet, however that works for you, can be extremely liberatory, especially in a context, if you're a full-time organizer or even just a part-time organizer, that can be kind of stressful. It's stressful to deal with violence, state violence, right? It's stressful to deal with gender-based violence, have conflict in different political spaces. That sucks, right? It can be hard. But in order to continue to sustain yourself, I think that in addition to taking breaks and talking it out, what I have discovered in the past 3 months is that finding creative outlet, it opens a new pathway to freedom.
I'll talk about what challenges me and kind of worries me, and it always has. And that is how to make sure that our work, and whether it's early work that I did to talk about how dangerous gender-based violence is and patriarchy is to Black communities, or current work about the hope and possibility of abolition feminism, or the work in both spaces around how mass criminalization and arrest and surveillance and incarceration is deadly violence to Black people, how to make sure that I keep my ear and heart open to people in my community, my neighborhood, who disagree with me, who feel like I'm not taking their experience into account. I don't live in the same nexus of danger that they live in, that I can't respond to some of the things, Alisa, that you were saying earlier about, what do we say to people who right now are terrified and can't think of anything else to do other than call 911, even though they don't want to do that, they can't do it. But how do I make sure that my message and my experience and the stories I listen to and where I've come to is at least heard, and that I'm hearing from people who disagree with me? I've learned that there's some people who I don't care if they disagree with me. I don't mean it like that I don't care about them as people, but I'm not trying to influence them. But there are people who I want to be in conversation and community with, like my people, my family, my people. And I want to do that thoughtfully and generously and with some grace, but also with a firm commitment to what I think is true. It's not always easy to find that balance. Sometimes it's, I guess, easier than others, but that's a challenge for me. And I'm thinking about now how to talk in particular to some of the, for example, the Black women who are advocates at sort of the national policy level, who finally feel like they have a voice and people are respecting them and they are getting money, Alisa, because they are arguing certain kinds of policies, and who feel like and they're people who I care about, so I don't think they say like terrible things about me personally, but we have really strong political disagreements. Sometimes looking at the same thing, we have strong political disagreements, and I'm trying to figure out how to manage that a little bit. And the thing I would say to new organizers is that what has sustained me in this work is the intentional building of community, friendships, family, the joy, the fun that we have. I mean, people often ask, how is it you've done this for so long? And, of course, part of it, my initial reaction is because I have a political commitment to it. But that's like not all I have. I also have the best friends that I've ever made in my life, people who I trust with my life, who have been alongside me in this work, all across the country, in some cases all around the world, different generations doing different kind of work, but it's my people. And I have been able to sustain the my people part, even when we're losing the campaigns or even when we can't figure out and we have to close the organization, that we still have each other. And the each other part is really important. In some ways, I think it would be easier to have the each other part in a world when we can have kind of virtual relationships. But I actually think that having each other part was built on those long days at conference centers or sitting around a table and in a coffee shop, or just building care for each other. Care that's deep and that's, for me, everlasting. I hope young organizers can find that.
Thanks to the amazing authors and organizers that kicked off this work and who are making this world a better place for all of us every single day. As always, I encourage you to take the lessons you learned today and keep practicing. Have you facilitated a process using community accountability tools or strategies? We want to hear your stories. Creative Interventions and Just Practice Collaborative want to share news stories from people who are taking action to end interpersonal violence without the use of police or carceral systems. Find the link in our show notes to learn more. Stories for Power is presented by Creative Interventions and Just Practice Collaborative. Executive produced by Mimi Kim, Shira Hassan, and Rachel Kydor. Produced by Emergence Media. Audio editing and mixing by Joe Namey and Il Weaver. Music composed by Scale Hands and L05 of Complex Movements in collaboration with Aya Simone. Stay tuned for more episodes of the Stories for Power podcast. Check out our show notes and go to storiesforpower.org to learn more.